Hey folks, and welcome to our second video on Gilles Deleuze's Cinema books. In this video, we're just going to talk about the first chapter of Cinema 1, the movement image, in which we'll dive into the philosophical aspects of the book. So remember from last time, the basic way that we want to summarize the difference between the movement image and the time image as classifications for understanding two different modes of making cinema in the 20th century is that the movement image includes films in which time is subordinated to action and movement, while the time image includes films in which movement and action are subordinated to the flow of time. And at the end of the last video, we started to ask this question: how are the movement image and time image in cinema related to philosophical concepts concerning movement and time? Remember, Deleuze might say this in response to that. He might say movement image and time image are not just classifications of cinema, they're also philosophical concepts derived from the work of Henri Bergson. And this is exactly where we're going to go in this video. So the first chapter is called Thesis on Movement, First Commentary on Bergson. It's one of four commentaries on the philosopher Henri Bergson that occurs in these two books. And basically what you'll get in these chapters is an account from Deleuze of some major arguments that Bergson makes, and then Deleuze will kind of respond to those arguments. So I think the first thing that we should do is just go over who this person Henri Bergson is. If you recall from the last video, I said that Deleuze is often understood as a process philosopher, or a philosopher who is interested in process. I might say that Henri Bergson is the French philosopher associated with process or process philosophy. And one of the main things that a process philosopher is going to subscribe to is the idea that processes, rather than static substances, is what is primary in the universe. And another major important thing we might say about Bergson is that he's primarily interested in inner mental life. That is, the kinds of things that we experience in our pure interior states. So he's interested in things like memory and imagination. And he's also interested in feeling or affect. He's also interested in intuition, which is an important word for him. It kind of means something a little bit different than how we mean intuition in ordinary language, but it does share with that ordinary language definition the idea that intuition is not derived from rational principles. You might say another major principle of Bergson's work is that he's critical of the capacity of science, and you might say scientism. Like a lot of major 20th century thinkers, Bergson is going to be skeptical, not necessarily of science for science's ability to do the things that science is supposed to do, but he'll be skeptical of the degree to which science leaks into all these areas of life that can't necessarily be understood or should be understood by scientific methods and principles. So let's leap into the text. This first part of the chapter is called First Thesis, Movement and Instant. Deleuze will say, according to the first thesis, that is Bergson's first thesis, movement is distinct from the space covered. Space covered is past, movement is present, the act of covering. The space covered is divisible, indeed infinitely divisible, whilst movement is indivisible, or cannot be divided without changing qualitatively each time it is divided. So that in a nutshell is Bergson's first thesis, but it's a little bit hard to parse, and I think one of the easiest ways to understand it is to invoke an older idea in the history of philosophy, which is Zeno's paradox, an ancient Greek thought experiment. So there are a few different versions of Zeno's paradox, but I'm going to give you what I think is the simplest one. Imagine that this guy that you're looking at right now needs to walk from where he is standing to the tree. Seems like a simple enough task. But rationally we know that if he's going to make his way from where he's standing to where the tree is, he's going to have to at least get to the halfway point between himself and the tree. And reasonably, he'll also have to get to the halfway point of that. And reasonably, he'll have to get to the halfway point of that halfway point. And notice that I could actually keep saying he would have to get to these halfway points of halfway points of halfway points, and so on. That there are in fact an infinite number of halfway points that he would have to cover. And if in fact he would have to cover an infinite number of halfway points, then he would never make it to the tree at all, because it would take him an infinity of time to traverse these infinitely micro distances. So we have a paradox. Zeno clearly, in common sense perception, can get to the tree. But in this strange way that I presented the traversal of space to you, it's impossible for him to get to the tree. What's going on here? So this is a rather well-known paradox, and there are a number of ways that you might quote-unquote solve the paradox. In fact, the invention of calculus is understood to be one way of solving the paradox. The word calculus actually means small pebble. because calculus is all about breaking down something big into really, really, really small parts. But for Bergson, he doesn't just want to solve the problem. He wants to use this paradox as an illustration of a habit of thought that he thinks is a problem. He'll say that the paradox illustrates a scientific habit of thought, a habit of thought that gets in the way of how the universe really is. One way he'll put this habit of thought is to say that the paradox relies on presenting time as space. Bergson will say that we have a habit of treating time like it's space, which might sound a little strange or nonsensical, but think about things like timelines. If I literally want to map out a year of my life, I might begin by actually drawing a line and marking out yearly divisions. And if I want to zoom in on a particular month or week of my life, I might get in even closer and mark out divisions within division. These are all spatial markers, and they're quite useful for us to make sense of and organize the time that we live in. But Bergson will say that even though this is a useful way of measuring and mapping time, it actually obscures the actuality of time, which is not spatial at all, he says. Instead, Bergson will argue, and this is a major argument of a lot of his books and works throughout his life, that time should be understood as what he calls duration, or in the French, duree. So once again, duration can be understood as a philosophy of time that is opposed against what we might call clock time, or in a more abstract way, the spatialization of time. Just as we tend to map out time with timelines, we also use numbers to organize time into conventional markers, like the 24 hours of the day, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, and so forth. But Bergson wants to say that these things actually obscure our experience. One example of our experience of time as not being perfectly encapsulated by clock time is that based on the activity that we're doing and our attention to it, a minute can feel like an hour, and an hour can feel like a minute. Duration is a way of thinking about time that treats very seriously our subjective experience of time. And it says that our subjective experience of time is not false because it's subjective, but rather the kinds of things that we experience as human beings when we experience time are closer to the actuality of what time is. So a few things follow from the claim that time is better understood as duration than clock time. As you might imagine, there's a strong relationship between the thing we call time and the thing we call movement. Movement, as we saw from Zeno's paradox, is often understood as a translation in space across time. But Bergson is going to make a few arguments based on his idea that time is duration. And these arguments are not just about time, they're about movement. The first is that movement isn't divisible. If movement was divisible, then our guy trying to walk to the tree would never walk to the tree, because he'd have to walk infinitely divided little spaces to get to the halfway point to the halfway point to the halfway point and so on of the tree. Bergson will also say that movement is transformation, not translation, in space. Hold that thought for now, because we'll get to it later. And he'll put that second idea in a different way, that movement is qualitative change, not quantitative change. This is just a preview for the second and third theses of Bergson, but I just want you to see how all these things are related for now. So let's return to the text. According to the first thesis, movement is distinct from the space covered. That's another way of saying that you can't divide movement into little spatial bits, because you'd fall into a trap. But then Deleuze says that before being developed, the first thesis contains another proposition. You cannot reconstitute movement with positions in space or instants in time. So in a sense, this is just another consequence of what he was trying to say about Zeno's paradox. You can't get movement from having all these little tiny micro positions and then synthesizing them. Now that might seem pretty abstract, but actually, in a second, it's not going to. Because Bergson has a really great metaphor for this. He calls it the cinematographic illusion. Remember how cinema is put together. At its most basic technological level, the moving image that we're seeing here is the result of a rapid succession of still images flashing by you at a rate of usually 24 frames per second. What you're looking at here is an early experiment done by Edward Muybridge, one of the first people to put together individual snapshots of a moving being, in this case a jockey on a horse, and then synthesize them to see how it would look when they moved together. Bergson's interest in this is that it serves as a really great metaphor for a problem of thinking. So this is what Bergson will say, and this is actually Deleuze quoting Bergson in the pages of Cinema 1. He'll say, "We take snapshots of the passing reality. Perception, intellection, language so proceed in general. Whether we would think becoming, or express it, or even perceive it, we hardly do anything else than set going a kind of cinematograph inside us. So what Bergson is saying is that we have, as human beings, a deep-seated habit of thought and a habit of perception, that we see movement in the world as a succession of snapshots that are synthesized together, as if we have little movie cameras in our perceptual and cognitive apparatus. But keep in mind here that when he says this, he's saying that it's false. It blinds us to the truth. This is where Deleuze is going to start to respond to Bergson's thesis. Because remember, Deleuze's book is about cinema. So this is how Deleuze responds. And this is only the first part of his response. Deleuze says, firstly, is not the reproduction of the illusion also its correction? Can we conclude that the result is artificial because the means are artificial? Cinema proceeds with photograms, that is, with immobile sections, 24 images per second. But what it gives us is not the photogram. It is an intermediate image to which movement is not appended or added. So the simplest argument that he's putting forth is, even though the cinematic image is the result of a succession of still images, what we see is not a succession of still images. What we see is movement. In other words, what it gives us, that is what the cinema gives us, is not the photogram. He might say it this way: look, the image is not simulating or representing or even producing the illusion of movement. It is itself movement. And then he's going to ask, how did Bergson miss this basic point? So Deleuze is going to think to himself, why did Bergson think this way about cinema? And then he'll start to say something that's going to matter a lot for Deleuze's cinema books. He says, the essence of a thing never appears at the outset, but in the middle, in the course of its development, when its strength is assured. Is it not the same thing with the cinema? Is not cinema at the outset forced to imitate natural perception? On the one hand, the viewpoint of movies was fixed. The shot was therefore spatial and strictly immobile. On the other hand, the apparatus for shooting was combined with the apparatus for projection, endowed with a uniform abstract time. So what he's talking about here is not actually the technology of moving images. He's talking about movies, the history of the medium that we call movies. And he's saying that the essence of movies, if we can say that there is an essence of movies, was not there at the beginning of the first movies. It wasn't there, he says, in the movie that you're looking at. The Lumiere brothers' 1895 film, The Train Arrives at the Station. In fact, he'll call this early stage of cinema primitive. Deleuze is not interested in early cinema. He's only interested in films once they started to tell stories. In other words, once their quote-unquote viewpoint was no longer fixed, that is, when the camera started to move, when the shot would give way to another shot through editing, and when the machine that we use to record images was actually distinct from the machine that we use to project them, thereby separating the process between the recording of raw footage and the thought that goes into composing a movie. And Deleuze will actually point out that it matters to look at when Bergson wrote his major books. The book that we might say is most influential on the cinema books, Bergson's Matter and Memory, was written in 1896, or rather it was published in 1896. So it was not in fact touched by the history of movies. The book that Deleuze is talking about in this chapter, Creative Evolution, came out in 1907. Notice that while a lot of cinematic development happened in the years between 1895 and 1907, in the grand scheme, the years between 1895 and 1906 are still the years of what film scholar Tom Gunning is going to call the cinema of attractions. A mode of filmmaking in which what matters is showcasing the novelty of the medium and a direct presentation of spectacles than a narrative in which a spectator is meant to be absorbed. So notice that in 1902 with A Trip to the Moon, or with 1905 with something like Tom Tom the Piper's Son, we're still getting the kind of pre-narrative staples that Deleuze is talking about. A fixed viewpoint, a camera that doesn't enter space and get close to characters. We're not getting the codes of editing that are going to emerge in the 19-teens. It's notable that one of the first filmmakers that is going to matter a lot for Deleuze is D.W. Griffith, whose short films that demonstrate early classical continuity techniques are happening around 1911 and after Bergson's book Creative Evolution, and certainly after Matter and Memory. So Deleuze will continue. The evolution of the cinema, the conquest of its own essence or novelty, was to take place through montage, the mobile camera, and the emancipation of the viewpoint, which became separate from projection. So here Deleuze is making quite clear that what interests him is not necessarily the fact of cinema's ability to synthesize movement in a realistic way, but that he's interested in these techniques that filmmakers will use to tell stories and express, ultimately, a way of thinking. And the issue that he's trying to argue here is that all of this stuff happened after Bergson was writing his philosophy. at least the philosophy that he's looking at. Let's summarize. Bergson's first thesis is that movement is not equivalent to the space that is covered when you move. Little instants stitched together, as in the cinema, makes what he calls false movement. Deleuze's response? He might say, I agree with the first part, but not quite with the part about cinema, because 1, what we experience in cinema is movement itself, and number 2, cinematic techniques don't merely transcribe human perception. And he might add, those techniques didn't emerge until after you wrote these books. So I can't fault you, my friend Bergson, for not picking up on the possibilities and the essence of cinema. What I mean by transcribe human perception is that one of the implied reasons that Deleuze finds the essence of cinema in the techniques of moving the camera and of montage, put in the service of storytelling, is that once you have those techniques, it's clear that they're not merely mimicking what the human eye can do. They're clearly going beyond it. So you can no longer use cinema as a metaphor for the thing that Bergson uses cinema as a metaphor for, which is a habit of seeing movement in time as a succession of little tiny instants or positions. Okay, that's the first thesis. What's the second thesis? Deleuze titles the second thesis, Privileged Instants and Any Instant Whatevers. This is how he introduces it. He says, Creative Evolution, which is that book that Bergson wrote, advances the second thesis. The error remains the same as the first, that of reconstituting movement from instants. But there are 2 ways of doing this, the ancient and the modern. So basically the second thesis adds to the first. If Bergson's first thesis is that human beings have this bad habit of thought and of perception, he says that history shows us that there's 2 ways of committing this error. One's ancient and one's modern. He calls the ancient error privileged instants. When he says ancient, he means ancient Greek, relating to the ancient Greek thinkers, especially philosophers. And the modern, he's calling any instant whatever. So, in order to understand exactly what he means by privileged instant and how exactly that is an ancient mode of thought, I think we have to turn to creative evolution. Because to my mind, Deleuze doesn't quite offer enough information for us to understand the argument. And by the way, if you're curious about reading Bergson, Bergson is a complex philosopher, but his writing is way easier to read than Deleuze's. So in Creative Evolution, Bergson says, Plato's forms, which the mind isolates and stores up in concepts, are then only snapshots of the changing reality. They are moments gathered along the course of time. They enter into eternity. So if you're familiar with Plato, or if you watched some of my other videos, you'll be familiar with Plato's theory of the forms, which is basically a theory about how human beings have concepts. How do we know what beauty is? How do we know what a chair is? How do we know what a lion is? Plato says that we know what these things are because there are forms or ideal versions of those concepts that exist in a transcendent realm. A realm that contains the form of the chair, the form of the good, the form of the beautiful, the form of the lion. So that when we see chairs in the world, or that we see lions in the world, or that we see things that are beautiful in the world, we'll know that we can judge those things as chairs, lions, and beautiful things. Bergson says that bound up in this way of thinking is the theory of time and movement. Think about it for a second. He says that if you think about it, the forms are themselves snapshots of the changing reality. They are moments gathered along the course of time. They enter into eternity. Think about the difference between a chair that has existed for 200 years and has withered over time, and compare it to the form of the chair that exists in that transcendent realm, untouched by time. If you believe that the chair in the world is a mere reflection or a mirror of the true chair, you might have a different attitude about time than Bergson thinks is useful or correct. Think about it this way. Think about how a Platonist might think about aging. He actually talks about this in Creative Evolution. He says the forms of Plato correspond to privileged or salient moments in the history of things, those in general that have been fixed by language. They are supposed, like the childhood or the old age of a living being, to characterize a period of which they express the quintessence, all the rest of this period being filled by the passage from one form to another. In other words, if you're a Platonist, how are you going to make sense of concepts like baby, adolescent, teenager, adult? Aren't these words just abstractions for markers of time and the development of a human being? And isn't a human being always in the stage of development, always changing, always growing? These individual images represent stages of human development, but they are themselves literally just snapshots, privileged instants that we abstract particular words from in order to make sense of a process that I might call human development. Once again, Bergson is going to admit that this way of thinking is habitual, even useful, but that it obscures a truth about the fact that human development is a process that never stops. And so let's get back to the way that Deleuze will present this information. He will say, movement conceived in this way will thus be the regulated transition from one form to another. That is, an order of poses or privileged instants as in a dance. So in a sense, we can think of these individual icons as poses, privileged instants. And they might be reinforced by a Platonic philosophy that understands the state of childhood as a reflection of the form of the child. And once again, for Bergson, this is a fallacious way of thinking. So that's privileged instants. What about any instant whatever? This is what Deleuze says about any instant whatever. He'll say, the modern scientific revolution has consisted in relating movement not to privileged instants, but to any instant whatever. Although movement was still recomposed, it was no longer recomposed from formal transcendental elements, or poses, but from immanent material elements, or sections. So think for a moment about that very strange and alienating phrase, any instant whatever. What does that really mean? Well, it means that instead of abstracting privileged poses as representing particular states within time, like we do with child and adolescent, any instant whatever, as we'll see in a moment, is a way of thinking about time and movement that breaks the flow of time into equally spaced but arbitrary little segments or pieces. So notice that I'm not using a statue to represent any instant whatever, but I'm using what we've already talked about, which is the cinematographic illusion of movement. There's good reason for this. Think about any graph like this that you've seen in math class, right? In physics class, or perhaps in geometry, if you're trying to map the trajectory of a soccer ball across time t, what you're going to do is make sure that you have equally spaced increments of time to measure the spatial trajectory of that soccer ball. This is how you truly understand the quote-unquote objective trajectory of the ball, according to the rules of physics, which relate to the rules of modern mathematics and geometry, which also relate to modern astronomy. Deleuze will say that this idea of looking at movement and time according to the any instant whatever coincides with the emergence of modern physics, geometry, and astronomy, and also calculus, which, remember, is the thing that helped us solve Zeno's paradox in a practical way. But then Deleuze will say that one more thing emerged or coincided with the any instant whatever, and that was cinema itself, for the very reason that we talked about in Thesis 1. Deleuze will say, the determining conditions of the cinema are the following. Not merely the photo, but the snapshot, the equidistance of snapshots. Deleuze will remind us that the long exposure photo belongs to the other lineage, the lineage that he'll call privileged instants. He says, it is in this sense that the cinema is the system which reproduces movement as a function of any instant whatever. He's saying something really smart here. What he's kind of implying is that on a particular view, you can just group all the photographic arts together. You have long exposure photography, and then came snapshot photography or instantaneous photography, and then you needed instantaneous photography to produce the succession of individual images in rapid succession that would produce the moving image. But he's saying that if you really care about the development of movement and time, or the way that we think about movement and time in the history of thought, that you would really slow down in your assessment of that history of photographic images. Because once we developed the instantaneous photograph, something wildly changed. And it's true almost on a practical level. As soon as the technological development of instantaneous photography emerged, that is, a way of making photographs in which you didn't have to sit for a long time for the exposure of the camera to capture your image. As soon as you could take a micro sliver of time and have an image of it, people experimented. On your left is an early instantaneous photograph in which folks wanted to, say, capture themselves in the middle of moving. And you also got people like Edward Muybridge on the one hand and Etienne Jules Mouret on the other hand, who would utilize instantaneous photography to start to analyze movement, like what you're seeing in the image in the top right. And to support the implied idea that there's a big difference between long exposure and instantaneous photography, Tom Gunning has written about the almost negative response to seeing images produced with instantaneous photography. He quotes one response to the famous image of Muybridge's horse, the image that proved once and for all that yes, in fact, a horse does lift up all four legs at a certain point when it's running. Muybridge revealed a horse's leg crumpled together in a wad beneath its belly, resembling a crushed spider. It's almost like the any instant whatever produces images that rub up against the kind of idealized images that folks have been creating with painting and with long exposure photography. And that might change the way that we think about the world. So Deleuze will continue. And if movement had to be related to the any instant whatever in order to analyze it, it was hard to see any interest in the synthesis of reconstitution based on the same principle, except a vague interest of confirmation. This is why neither Marais nor Lumiere held out much hope for the invention of the cinema. So what's he saying here? Well, he's giving us kind of an important history lesson, which is that people like Marais, who once again made images like the one that you see on the top right, and people like the Lumiere brothers, who made the first actual moving images, they didn't have much hope for the invention of cinema, thereby sacrificing the scientific value of any instant whatever for the sake of a silly illusion that basically just looks like the thing that we see with our eyes. So to put it simply, the snapshots as snapshots actually have more scientific value than the moving image does, because they analyze movement in front of us, instead of just give us a satisfying illusion of movement. But the second observation is less about science than it is about cinema as art. Did it have artistic interest? This did not seem likely either, since art seemed to uphold the claims of a higher synthesis of movement and to remain linked to the poses and forms that science had rejected. For centuries, human beings created images, especially with paintings. They, in a sense, created more idealistic images of humans and creatures in motion than they would have if they deduced those images from a technological apparatus like an instantaneous camera or a movie camera. Consider this painting, Horse Racing at Epsom, by Géricault, which has been talked about by certain philosophers and art critics as being a good example of an image of movement that does not correspond with scientific accuracy, and yet it might express a kind of poetry and a kind of beauty because of that defiance of accuracy. This is the thing that people were seeing, such that when they saw the actual image of the horse, they were freaked out by it looking like a crumpled up spider. Following a similar idea, we might look at the famous modernist sculptor, Rodin, who said that it is the artist who is truthful, while the photograph lies, for in reality, time never stops. And a sculpture of his, like Walking Man, is kind of understood in a similar way to the Géricault painting, which is that this representation of human locomotion is not accurate with respect to the way that human beings actually walk. And yet, nevertheless, it expresses a feeling, something that feels right, about how walking looks and feels. These are the kinds of things that Deleuze will say in order to provide some kind of historical and cultural commentary on these two historical ways of conceiving movement. But what is Bergson's attitude toward these two distinct ways of conceiving movement? His thesis is that both of these ways are false. You might put it this way: despite modern science desperately trying to distinguish itself from ancient thought, they're both false. Both privileged instants and any instant whatever replace movement with a mobile instance. What do I mean by that? Here's the simplest way that I can put it. You have your privileged instance on the top, and you have your any instant whatever on the bottom. What's different about them is the way that the privileged instants are indeed taking particular moments from the broad timescale of human development and saying, that's a baby, that's infancy, that's childhood, that's teenage years, that's adulthood. And that by no means are these individual privileged nouns, which help us organize the timescale of human development, equally and arbitrarily or scientifically spaced out. That's how they're different. But how they're the same is that they're both taking individual moments. You can represent both with a timeline. They both spatialize time. That's the problem for Bergson. What's Deleuze's response? Bergson misses something crucial. The any instant whatever harbors something revolutionary. When one relates movement to any moment whatever, or any instant whatever, one must be capable of thinking the production of the new, that is, of the remarkable and the singular at any one of these moments. He makes it clear that he thinks that there's something revolutionary about the any instant whatever. But I think it's only in the third thesis that what he says here is going to start to make sense. So let's hold this thought for now. Third thesis, movement and change. Deleuze says, and this is Bergson's third thesis, not only is the instant an immobile section of movement, but movement is a mobile section of duration, that is, of the whole or of a whole, which implies that movement expresses something more profound, which is the change in duration or in the whole. So now we have a whole new set of weird terms to make sense of. What does he mean by whole? What does he mean by mobile section of duration? What does he mean by immobile section? We're going to try to figure all this out. Here's how I'm going to simplify it for now. Bergson's thesis looks like this. Movement is transformation of the whole, not translation in space. So far, we've been really dwelling on the second part, what movement is not. So let's start there to make sure that we understand what that means. Movement is not translation in space. By movement as translation in space, I simply mean what we've been talking about this entire time. The human habit, reinforced by scientific methods of mapping movement and time, to understand the trajectory of this soccer ball in terms of equally segmented portions of time and equally segmented portions of position in space. This is movement as translation, and this, Bergson says, is a false way of understanding what movement really is. Now's where things get really interesting. If that's not what movement is, what is it? Well, we can think about it a few different ways. One of the ways that we can think about it, though, is movement as transformation of the whole. What do Bergson and Deleuze mean by the whole? For now, we can think of the whole as kind of simply meaning everything. And in fact, in the French, the whole is translated from tout, T-O-U-T, which means often everything, the all, the whole of all things. So what does it mean to say that movement is transformation of everything? To help explain this, Bergson gives a very famous example of sugar dissolving into water. And Deleuze talks about that example. What is Bergson's main point of the famous example of sugar dissolving in water? That the movement of translation, which detaches the sugar particles and suspends them in the water itself, expresses a change in the whole, that is, in the content of the glass, a qualitative transition from water, which contains a sugar lump, to the state of sugared water. So I find this quite useful. Basically, Bergson is trying to get us to understand what movement truly is. And that it's too often that when we give examples of movement, we give things like the soccer ball trajectory, or I throw something to you and you catch it. So Bergson carefully selects this example of another thing that's moving. Does the sugar not move when you put it into water? He says that the movement of translation, which detaches the sugar particles and suspends them in the water itself, is one way of looking at this as a movement as translation. But rather, what's really going on is that when sugar dissolves in water, you're getting a change in the whole, a change in the content of the glass. Not a quantitative transition from position A to position B as the sugar is, say, moving, these little micro increments, but rather a qualitative transition from water, which contains a sugar lump, to the state of sugared water. In other words, the thing that was water transforms into something completely different. The water becomes sugar water, the sugar becomes sugar water, and something else happens. Bergson spends a long time talking about this example, talking about the experience of waiting for the sugar to dissolve. And that waiting is really important, almost more important, to express the reality of what time really is. And Deleuze will comment on this part of Bergson's example too. He'll say, above all, what Bergson wants to say using the glass of sugared water is that my waiting, whatever it be, expresses a duration as mental, spiritual reality. So you might say that when the sugar dissolves in water, the water and sugar combine into something new, they transform. But so does the observer change in the time it takes to wait for the dissolving to happen. And so does the glass change, since it's also a material object that literally is always changing because it's subject to the decay that happens to all material things as they move through time. And this is the idea of the whole as everything. It's just that we're better able to understand it with the example of sugar dissolving into water than with the soccer ball. So once again, movement is transformation of the whole because everything is always changing. That's a really crude way to put one of the things that Bergson is trying to say, that everything is changing. It's not as if the soccer ball is just sitting there, not moving, and then starts to move once I kick it. That's the conventional way of seeing it. Bergson wants us to see the soccer ball as always in a process of changing because it is located in a world in which time is always passing. And that moving location is just one way of seeing the perpetual transformation that is itself time. Time, in Bergson's words, as what he calls duration, right? I also want to make clear that usually when people talk about Bergson's example of sugar and water, they say that Bergson is using the example to explain what he calls duration. So this movement of the soccer ball, Bergson wants to say, is also transformation, even if we don't often view it that way. Deleuze will say, by movement in space, the objects of a set change their respective positions, but through relations, the whole is transformed or changes qualitatively. It's not just that the ball that is translocated or translated in space. The ball literally interacts with the ground, you might say. The parabolic curve is a function of gravity, which is an attraction of two forces. And a third force, the kicker, must be factored in. This is not just the movement of a ball. This is an entire situation that is in flux. And it was always in flux, even before the ball got kicked. One of Deleuze's commentators, Ronald Bogue, has a passage in his book, Deleuze on Cinema, where he tries to express this idea, and I think he expresses it with an example really usefully. He says, As I look out my window now, I see a dog dozing beneath a tree and a girl bringing food to the dog. The dog eats, the girl pets the dog, and the leaves of the tree rustle in the breeze. I see a translation of bodies in space, a shift in the positions of the girl and the dog, a slight undulation of the leaves of the trees. This is the conventional way of seeing movement that Bergson acknowledges but wants to say is not the truth. Bo continues, but I also see in the movements of these bodies an ongoing transformation of relations between them, metamorphosizing configurations of girl-dog-tree. And that change in relations is a qualitative change in a constant temporal flow. The dog passing from sleeping to eating, to having been fed, the girl from bringing food to petting the dog. The movement relations I observe extend beyond the frame of my window into an open vibrational whole, some of whose effects are invisible and others visible. Once again, remember the soccer ball. The fact that it moves when somebody kicks it is a very, very visible and pronounced symptom of its being in time. But even when it's not moving, quote unquote, visibly moving after being kicked, it's still in time. Bergson wants us to understand that everything is always moving, always changing. Movement is transformation of the whole, not translation in space. Now, the next thing that Bergson is going to say, and that Deleuze is going to report that Bergson is going to say, is that there's something about the whole that we need to understand, this everything. Deleuze says that the whole is the open. He'll use that word all the time. Check out the passage. He says, according to Bergson, the whole is neither given nor givable. If the whole is not givable, it is because it is the open, and because its nature is to change constantly, or to give rise to something new, in short, to endure. So what he's trying to say here is that for Bergson, the whole, the everything that is changing, is not determined. It is, by definition, unpredictable. Because if Bergson is trying to convince you that the universe is perpetually moving, you might imagine the universe to look something like the thing on the left, a mechanic system of perpetual motion, like a set of cogs in a machine. And indeed, this might be a particularly attractive view, given how much viewpoints based on certain kinds of scientific research try to understand the mechanistic qualities, the predictable qualities of the universe, the laws of physics, the movements of the planets, the genetic predispositions that we might have. But it is a huge part of Bergson's philosophy that the perpetual movement and change of the universe is not deterministic. The whole, he says, is not like this on the left, predictable, mechanical, determined. It's like this on the right, unpredictable, creative, new. The movement of the ink in the water is utterly unpredictable. It's almost perceptually overwhelming in its novelty. And if you remember from the first video, one of the most important aspects of Deleuze's thought is that he's obsessed with the idea of how to create new thought, given all the ways in which human beings are directed by habits of thought, and that our worldviews are often determined by particular apparatuses of thinking, the paradigms in which we live. One of the reasons that Deleuze is so interested in Bergson is he thinks that Bergson is also a philosopher of the new, of the free. So far what we have is that movement is transformation of a whole, not a translation in space, and that this whole, or this everything, is open. It's always in flux. It's always changing in unpredictable ways. But now Deleuze wants to acknowledge that there is some practicality to seeing movement as translation, not transformation, and that sometimes we need a certain kind of language to make a distinction between the two. So he'll say this. He says, the whole and the wholes must not be confused with sets. Sets are closed, and everything which is closed is artificially closed. The sets are in space, and the wholes, are in duration, are duration itself, insofar as it does not stop changing. So this, in a sense, is a bit of practical vocabulary, which is going to be super useful for the rest of the cinema books, because it's going to apply to cinema. But for now, let's just understand what Deleuze is giving us here. By set, Deleuze is referring to a way of thinking about how to label our observation that movement is in fact translation in space. He defines set this way. Sets or closed systems which are defined by discernible objects or distinct parts. Think of our soccer ball. When I think of this in the conventional way, as movement as translation, I identify a singular object, the ball, and I track its displacement over time. But to look at this in the Bergsonian way, to look at it as a transformation of a whole, you have to think of it this way. Deleuze defines the whole as a spiritual reality which constantly changes according to its own relations. We're seeing this same thing in a different way. Not as a ball simply moving through space, but as a transformation of the relation ball, ground, kicker. So Deleuze will say that seeing the world as sets and wholes is basically a kind of aspect perception, seeing the same thing in two different ways. He says, thus, in a sense, movement has two aspects. On the one hand, that which happens between objects or parts i.e. movement as set. On the other hand, that which expresses the duration or the whole, i.e. movement as whole. We can therefore say that movement relates the objects of a closed system to open duration, and duration to the objects of the system which it forces to open up. How might I explain this? In other words, because I can see movement as translation, the ball changes position over time, or as transformation, the ball field player's nexus transforms. It is movement itself that functions as the intermediary between how things seem, that is, as closed sets or as translations, and how they actually are, that is, as open wholes or as transformations. So after Deleuze has been through all of this, you might start to wonder, what does this have to do with anything? But he's going to throw a Hail Mary at the end of this chapter and basically say that all of this is related to the categories that are going to matter for this book, which are indeed about cinema. He'll say, now we are equipped to understand the profound thesis of the first chapter of Bergson's Matter and Memory. Number one, there are not only instantaneous images, that is, immobile sections of movement. Two, there are, in fact, movement images, which are mobile sections of duration. And three, there are finally time images, that is, duration images, change images, relation images, volume images, which are beyond movement itself. So what's important to know about this is that everything that we discussed in this chapter corresponds to a cinematic classification. Remember when we said that Deleuze doesn't like early cinema because he needs cinema to have camera movement and cutting and storytelling? Deleuze is going to call those things movement images. And he's going to say that they're mobile sections of duration. Not snapshots, not translations, but chunks of the truth of how time works. But then he's going to say, or rather he's going to preview, that there's another kind of cinema, that if you look at it closely and understand how it works, not on a technological level, but on an aesthetic level, he's going to make the wild claim that those films don't just give us chunks of duration, they give us duration itself. They present us with duration. And then the next thing, and almost the more important thing that you need to know, is that the subsequent chapter, which is entitled Frame and Shot, Framing and Cutting, is going to use the language of closed set, wholes, and opens, so that everything that we talked about in terms of the metaphysics of time in this chapter is going to map onto the basic techniques and medium-specific properties of cinema in this order: frame, shot, cutting, camera movement, and montage. And that's what we'll discuss next time. Thanks.